last time Arsenal won, I wasn't even fertilised. I'm 21 years of age. Listen, the greatest day of my life. I've supported this club since nappies. Nappies.
22 years we've been waiting for this. Look at the streets of London. No club can do it like this. No club!
Now, don't worry, we're not going to become a football show for the night. It's not our wheelhouse. I'm sure my football analysis does not cut the mustard. But I just thought, the news tends to be quite miserable. Lots of people having a bad time. I thought it was nice to start with some people enjoying themselves for once. Of course, that was Arsenal fans celebrating winning the Premier League for the first time in 22 years. Aaron, public expressions of joy. We could do football analysis if you want, but I was just going to go a bit soppy and say how nice it is to see everyone getting together, big crowd, having a great time.
Isn't it predictable that Michael Walker goes soppy the minute a London club wins the Premier League? The London-centric Novara media promotes the winning team the minute they're from inside the M25. Oh, so predictable, Michael.
Something to that, although the thing is that Manchester City win it every year, right? So they don't go so crazy. It has to be a team who haven't won it for a while for it to matter.
This is going to upset some of our audience, but Manchester City aren't, as some old-timers would say, aren't a proper club.
Aren't a proper club.
They are, they are a proper club. They won titles and European trophies before the oil money came in, but they're not Liverpool, Man United, Arsenal.
Maybe there is some political significance here because for the past decade, the Northwest has dominated football. London has dominated politics. So perhaps this is an omen that we're doing a straight swap. So the Premier League title comes down from Manchester to North London. We kick out of North London or out of Downing Street. He's replaced by a Scouser. Think it works? You take that deal?
I think there's something to that. You see a kind of interesting snapshot of the changes of the global economy in the kinds of places that succeed in winning English championships over the last 30, 40 years. Believe it or not, Derby County were playing in a European Cup semi-final in the 70s. Right? Dundee United were making European Cup or Cup Winners' Cup semi-finals in the 80s. Aberdeen as well, famously under Alex Ferguson. But now, all the big European glamour clubs are in the major cities. PSG, Madrid, of course, that's historically true. Arsenal now in a European final. So PSG, a London-Paris final. I'm pretty sure that's the first time it's happening for the European Cup.
And the clubs on the South Coast is kind of new as well, right?
Yeah.
The Arsenal won, obviously, because Bournemouth drew with Man City.
Yeah.
Bournemouth, Brighton. That's kind of new that they'd be in the top half of the league.
But yeah, again, I'm saying that Man City aren't a quote-unquote proper club. Bournemouth are, a League Two club. That's the size of the club. They're a 10,000 stadium club. And they...
But there's money on the South Coast.
Well, there's money. They've just been managed very well as well. This is really interesting that, again, talking about the sort of wider economic story, the Premier League has attracted a ton of foreign direct investment, but also elite tier management, I guess. So you have lots of Americans coming in buying English clubs, Welsh clubs in the case of Wrexham, and they're using public relations techniques, they're using recruitment, they're using all the sort of cutting edge stuff with regards to training facilities. Bournemouth training facilities, Google it, the new training facilities are extraordinary. It's better than like AC Milan or Barcelona. It's incredible. So there's that story as well, right, of American capital coming into the English game, raising the standard.
American and Emirati capital with European managers makes the Premier League the best league in the world.
There's a Janan Ganesh column in this, isn't there?
There is something too.
I would say not even European managers, Spanish managers, right? You had Arteta, obviously, at Arsenal. You've got Iraola at Bournemouth. You've had Pep Guardiola at Barcelona in recent years. So Spanish managers.
Interesting. They can build high-speed rail and they can manage teams. Don't worry, we aren't going to spend the whole show talking about football. We're also not going to spend much of the show talking about Andy Burnham, which some of our viewers from the past two nights might be pleased about. Instead, tonight, we discuss the return of price controls to Britain, or at least return of talk of price controls. It's unclear if they will be implemented. We also discuss the UK's most powerful technologist you've never heard of. And we get an update from Paul Holden, the independent journalist, on how the Labour Together spying scandal potentially goes all the way to Downing Street. Before we get to our first story tonight, we just want to say a huge thank you to you. Over the past week, the response from our audience has been just absolutely incredible. We originally hoped to bring in 2,000 new regular supporters in this fundraising campaign. But as of today, more than 2,700 of you has signed up. Really, really appreciate it. We're really blown away. Really, really grateful to you all. Of course, if you're one of them, or if you've increased your donation or made a one-off donation, thank you so much. Your support is the reason we exist at all. And small regular donations give us the stability to be bold with our growth plans. And we'll be covering the upcoming by-election closely, but with more people backing our work, we can do more ambitious reporting and analysis in the months and years ahead. Of course, we want to be ambitious. We'd really love to hit 3,000 new regular supporters by the end of the week. So that's 300. We need more. We'll announce on Friday whether or not we've made it. So if you're new to the channel, or you've been watching for years and you value the work we do, please consider supporting us from just £1 a month at novara.media/support. You might associate price controls on food with the Soviet Union, but the UK Treasury is now pushing large supermarkets to cap prices on key groceries such as eggs, bread, and milk. Now, the plan is that the caps would not be mandatory. Supermarkets would instead receive incentives to impose caps on key goods. Now, the incentives would be the government easing packaging policies, so policies about what packaging supermarkets are allowed to use, and potentially delaying costly changes to rules around healthy food. So they say you make some of your essential goods cheaper, presumably you make a loss on them, and the government will help you out in other ways by giving you an opt-out in regulation. The move, of course, would be intended to help tackle the cost of living crisis, which is largely a result of the war in the Middle East blocking supply chains. UK food inflation rose to 3.7% in April, but as the effects of supply shocks trickle through to consumers, that's expected to go higher in the coming months. Supermarket leaders, though, are incensed by these plans. The chief executive of Marks and Spencer's has slammed the proposals as preposterous. Speaking earlier today, he said, Marks and Spencer's already made losses on milk, bread, and bananas. And he said the government's policies to increase business rates, national insurance contributions, and packaging charges had contributed to higher inflation. So he's saying it's not our fault, it's the government's whose policies have created this inflation. We're actually already making a loss on those key essential items. Stuart Rose is the former chairman of Asda. He's now a Tory Lord. He led the Remain campaign in the EU referendum. He was equally unimpressed by the reports of voluntary price caps.
I think the whole idea is stuff and nonsense, and it will never fly. I'm not conflicted anymore because I don't run any retail businesses anymore, but I've been in the industry a long time. This is smacks of state control. It's idiotic, it's dangerous, and it will never work. Now, you talk about profits. You need to talk about profits as a margin and not profits as cash. Yes, cash profit may have gone up. That's because sales have gone up, because the business is efficient and it's attracting more customers, and therefore it's doing the job that it should do, i.e. capitalism does work and customers get great choice and they make the choices of which store they go to and they're happy with what they get. I want to know if this idea ever comes to anything more serious than a discussion, who's going to pay the bill, who decides what products, the prices are sold at, who polices it, who's involved. Who is it? Small retailers, big retailers? I mean, it is absolutely nonsense, which is why I suspect nobody in the retail business actively at the moment wants to come onto your program.
Now, the point Rose made there about profit margins, he kind of has a point. The profit margin of UK supermarkets are generally between 2 and 4%. So for every £1 you spend in Tesco or Sainsbury's, after accounting for the cost of the stock, the rent, staff, and taxes, 2 to 4p goes to shareholders. It's also not just supermarket bosses making that point. Helen Bernard is Director of Research at the Trussell Trust, which is a food poverty charity. She wrote this on X. The UK has a very competitive grocery market with thin margins. Food prices rise because input costs go up. Government tinkering with price caps is not a serious solution to people on low incomes being unable to afford essentials. Focus on boosting incomes instead. Of course, there are many others who think a policy of price caps would be well overdue. One of them is James Meadway, friend of the show, and co-director of Verdant, a new Green Party-aligned think tank. I spoke to him earlier, and I began by asking him to explain what he understands these price cap proposals to amount to.
The details are a little bit sparse. The Financial Times broke the story yesterday evening. It basically says that the government has had conversations with supermarkets to control the prices of various essentials, bread, eggs, milk, this sort of thing, on a voluntary basis. And in exchange, the government has apparently suggested that it will loosen some regulations around packaging, and a few other things are highlighted. So it's an entirely voluntary scheme. It's at the level of having a discussion. Viewers with a long memory might remember back to Rishi Sunak's government also had a similar story emerge, I think around about 2023, 2024 sort of time. It's going back a bit. And it was a similar conversation that also met this ferocious resistance from the supermarkets themselves and their various apologists about what an awful infringement this is of their rights to set whatever price they feel like, I suppose. So there's not much detail here, but it's more the fact that the principle that the government can intervene in markets like this is being conceded by this story. And that, I think, is the important point here.
Would these even be, price controls as they're currently being briefed? Because to me, it seems just more like a quid pro quo. So the state says to supermarkets, if you're willing to sort of cross-subsidize eggs and milk and bread and probably make a loss on those products, then we will sort of help you reduce costs elsewhere by not imposing certain regulations on your business.
This is about the weakest form of price control you can imagine. I mean, it's being treated as something it isn't. And the really crazy reaction you're getting from some quarters about this really tells you something about the kind of ideological content, you might say, of this. The fact that supermarkets, apologists for supermarkets, free market economists all recognise that if you just concede a little bit that the government can ask supermarkets to behave like this, the risk is that what starts voluntary becomes involuntary, starts to talk about cutting back in their profits, starts to talk about other regulations that might be introduced in the public interest. So you get this ferocious reaction to what is, on balance, like a really sort of feeble scheme. It's not even like the SNP, the Scottish National Party, have been proposing up in Scotland, where, if I remember the details, it's actually a degree of compulsion that they want to introduce for supermarkets controlling prices. It's not just do this and we'll do something nice back.
So this policy, to my mind as well, seems very moderate. It also doesn't really seem like the government intervening in the price mechanism, because they're just saying, look, make a loss on these products and we'll help you out elsewhere. It's almost a subsidy by other means. In terms of the general issue about price controls, though, I assume, from what I see you tweeting, you would like something stronger. You would like mandatory price controls on essential goods.
When you get down to it, you have supermarkets in particular making very, very significant profits over the last sort of few years or so on thin margins. But the model here is to sell so much stuff to everyone that a thin margin, a small profit on each item, turns into a whacking great profit overall. And the question here is how you might use that profit better than it is being used. The boss of Tesco's has just paid himself, with the agreement of the board, a £1 million pay rise, taking his pay to £10.8 million. He is not suffering from a cost of living crisis. His customers are. This is not a good use of Tesco profits. There are better things you could do. And Tesco's have 28%, by the way, of UK grocery sales. So that's a huge amount of control and power that they have. What you see implicit in this story is a recognition from government that this is, in fact, how the market works, that a few large companies have a great deal of power, so you can talk to them, you can open a conversation, and you can see whether they might be open to helping out those people who are already being squeezed. And if the forecasts are correct, that squeeze on food prices, on the cost of living, is going to get a lot worse. The ferocious reaction tells me that you're going to have to start thinking about some form of legal compulsion at some level to try and make that happen if the supermarkets won't move themselves. It's going to be on them, by the way. There will be protests, I'd have thought, outside supermarkets coming down the line if the forecasts for significant price rises over the summer into the autumn actually start to come true.
On the low profit margins, though, the key fact here, you can make a social justice argument about whether or not the Tesco CEO should make £10 million. But if the profit margin on each good, on each item sold by a supermarket is 2 to 4%. So for every pound I spend in Tesco, 4% of it goes in profit. Then even if you entirely eradicate profit, all you're going to do is reduce food prices by 4%. Now, obviously, there are going to be lots of consequences for completely removing the profit motive in the supermarket industry. But let's just imagine that we do just get rid of it. Say you can't make any profit. All of your efficiency gains have to go to consumers. Still, that's only 4% off grocery costs. So I don't really see how this is in any way particularly a silver bullet or a meaningful plan when it comes to lowering grocery costs.
The point to get across here is that don't get mixed up between a thin margin and a huge mass of profits. That huge mass of profit is generated from a very, very large number of transactions, on average of which they have a fairly small margin. And it is market power. It is the fact that we have a few very large supermarkets that sell most of the food we buy that they're able to command these profits. So the question is, how might you use that surplus that they're generating to help support at least some people when they're doing their daily shop? And the suggestion here would be, well, you could use it to cross-subsidize to reduce the prices of essential goods. You can take some of that profit, instead of saying it all goes to shareholders, the CEO or senior managers or whoever else, you can say it can come back to consumers of certain kinds of goods. So you don't say just on average reduce margins across the board, so that, if you go and buy some Tesco's own brand super luxury thing, right at the top end, on which they make a very tasty profit, you're not saying, okay, bring that down to zero or whatever. You're saying maybe use some of the profits generated here to subsidize what is going on elsewhere. And that way you lift the bottom end and you support people who are having to buy the essentials that they need to live and having to pay an awful lot of money to do that. And you can see that even happening in individual superstores. Tesco's charge different prices for the same goods depending on where they're located. I can walk from my house here in Bethnal Green to one Tesco superstore and then another one. It's not necessarily easy walking distance, but it is walking distance, and they'll be charging two different prices for basically the same goods. So you can start to say things like, well, hang on, why are you treating consumers differently? How do we deal with food deserts where people are being priced out of basic items and having to go to food banks and all the rest of it? You can start to think about the price that we're paying for food, not as the wonderful magic of the market arriving at a price and this is the most efficient thing you can possibly imagine, but instead starting to think about that price as a claim on what society can do and how we're going to treat people in society. Now, that's the really important thing about these price controls. It is jamming open that argument. It's reintroducing the idea of what you used to call a moral economy, the idea that there's a fair price of goods, that people should be treated fairly when they go to the shops, that there's a reasonable amount we can ask people to pay. If we can start to win that argument, it prizes open a discussion about how the whole food system operates. So, of course, Tesco's and the rest don't like it, because it's a challenge to their profits, but that's why it's good.
But I suppose what I'm saying is, if the profit margins are that low, even if you had, let's say we made supermarkets publicly owned, right? We just nationalized the whole thing, so there's going to be no profit margin whatsoever. Then you've only reduced overall prices by 4p. So it just seems like, competition between supermarkets is quite strong. They do advertise their prices. When you go around Sainsbury's, it says Aldi price match, right? And Aldi is quite cheap. So there is, I suppose it's unclear to me in this particular industry, which does seem quite competitive where margins are low, how far price controls get us, other than what you're saying, which seems like a less radical argument, which is to say, let's just strong arm the supermarkets to cross-subsidize essential goods even more than they currently do.
That's the price control. If you're saying you will be controlled on the price you're setting, that is a price control. Let's be quite clear about this, right? So that's what it looks like if you do this properly. That's how it works at the supermarket end. The real challenge in the food system are the enormous profits being made by the very few agribusinesses who control the essentials of the food system, like basic things like the wheat trade, the cocoa trade, the fundamentals of food, the soybean trade. That's where the really massive profits are being generated on this sort of surge in prices that we're seeing. That's where a whole load of the profits disappear. But Tesco's and the rest are sitting there with very significant surpluses that they are generating that could be put to better public use. This, to me, starts to look like a sensible suggestion for how you're going to make the system work to the benefit of consumers, because all of us need to eat, and we need to eat fairly basic, essential things a lot of the time, like eggs. So why not say we're going to control the prices of these things, and supermarkets can use some of their profits to make sure that this can happen?
Yeah, and I suppose they won't just stop selling it because you're less likely to go into a supermarket if it doesn't have eggs, which is why they have loss leaders in the first place, right? So the M&S guy is saying that bread and milk are already loss leaders and bananas are already loss leaders, so they do already make a loss on those products. While you're here, James, you are co-director of a think tank, Verdant, aligned with the Green Party. You recently stood as a Green Party candidate. I want to get your thoughts on Andy Burnham standing in the Makerfield by-election. And what's your approach to it? What's your understanding of what the Green Party's approach to that by-election is?
Well, look, I'm going to say, first of all, Verdant is aligned with, but strictly independent of any political party. We'll happily talk to anybody who thinks that we might have good ideas about how to run this country better and in the interests of most people who live here, which would include, by the way, Andy Burnham. If he wants to come and have a conversation, we'd be very open to that. In terms of what the Greens do, I mean, I'm talking here on the politics and standing back a bit from the policy side. It's a tough one because Andy Burnham is personally very popular. That is on the polling, and judging by what people on the ground are saying, probably enough to carry him over the fact that Labour is deeply unpopular. And he can do something, which is killing reforms biggest argument that they've had over the last election, the locals, which was vote Reform to get Starmer out. Well, now it's like vote, everybody knows this, vote Burnham to get Starmer out, right? If you want to get rid of Keir Starmer, you've got to vote for Andy Burnham. Reform aren't going to do that. It's Andy Burnham that's going to do that. So I think Reform's big argument is being killed off. I think that'll be enough to carry the seat for it. Can't guarantee it. But this should also start to inform what a Green Party approach to this looks like, which is that you can't just subordinate what we are trying to say about the world to what Labour, even an Andy Burnham-led Labour, is saying about the world. There is a group of people out there who want to vote Green because of the distinctive offer it's making. There is the fact that the Green Party needs that political independence to be able to say, hang on a minute, you've got to do better. Because I've seen Andy Burnham already under some pressure, turning back on some of the claims he's made. You know, we're going to support the fiscal rules, this sort of thing. It's like, without that additional pressure there, you're subordinating political leadership to the Labour Party. And that, I think, is too close to giving a kind of blank check to Andy Burnham at that point in time. So my view on this is, look, this is democracy. People should, on the whole, be allowed to who they would really like to vote for. And this leans you towards the Greens standing, but let's face it, it's never going to be a target, or at least not anytime soon, going to be a target seat for the Greens.
Obviously, there is a possibility. Obviously, I don't think there are any easy choices for the Greens here, so I'm not saying this in a judgmental way. But there is a possibility that the difference, you know, that Reform scrape through, and the difference between Reform and Labour is the number of votes that the Greens get. I suppose how would you feel, as I assume you're a Green Party member, how would you feel in that circumstance? Would that just sort of be unfortunate, but the risk was worth it?
I think it's a balance of risks, and this is partly what the local party has to decide more than anybody else sort of peering in and trying to work out for them. They'll have a better sense of what the reality is like on the ground in Makerfield. The issue here is exactly as you lay out, and this is the politics as I would see it, is that if Burnham loses and it's a tight race and all the rest of it, then potentially Labour has this argument that it can use over the next few years. If you vote Green, you run the risk of getting Reform. And they'll try that on everywhere. They're trying it on already. And they'll try and reinforce that. Now, there's an extent to which they will be saying this regardless of what actually happens. We sort of know that's going to take place because that's politics. That's how you're going to argue the case here. But I think in the end, this is going to be a decision that's going to have to rely on a close local knowledge, like a realistic understanding of what the Greens are likely to do and what Andy Burnham is likely to do in the seat. And to me, that says is one of those advantages where the Greens are a decentralised party to an nth degree, where it's actually a good idea to let local members make the decision because they're the ones who are going to have to be knocking on doors or not. They're the ones who know what is best happening on the ground. But looking from the outside, it looks to me like Burnham is going to win, that it's not going to be as outstanding a win as perhaps he would wish for, but it looks to me like the polling, his personal popularity, the general bias of how you might think a campaign will go leans in the direction of him winning.
So since that interview with James Meadway, the Bank of England has intervened in the price control debate. So this is a tweet from Stephen Swinford from The Times. And he says, breaking, Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, suggests that price caps on essential goods in supermarkets are unsustainable. The question you have to think through is, are you doing it for some well-grounded temporary reason? If you start doing it as a matter of course, you are artificially moving prices relative to costs. That's not a sustainable thing to do in the long run. It does need to be thought through. And then Dr. Swati Dhingra, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, says lots of countries have tried price controls, but they have not worked. And then this is their quote. The biggest problem is you're dampening the price signal, precisely what you want people to react to. As a market economy, you can do that for a little bit, but how long can you let it go on? I grew up with price controls on food all my life. That story to some degree was very successful in being able to cure famine and poverty, but at the same time, it has ended up creating a highly distorted agricultural sector in India. Do it with a lot of caution and a lot of thinking behind what it is trying to target. Now, I don't know if it was these comments from the Bank of England or the furious reaction from the supermarkets, but the government is now briefing that Rachel Reeves is not going to include this proposal in her speech on the cost of living tomorrow, although they say discussions with the supermarkets are continuing. Aaron, this has really made the news today, I suppose because price control sounds very dramatic. I mean, to be honest, these proposals don't seem sort of like a huge intervention in the market to me, because just saying, please make those things cheap and we'll give you money elsewhere. But I don't know, what do you make of this?
Well, so on the interventions by people at the Bank of England, did QE work? Did 0% interest rates for over a decade work? Did that help the price signal? It absolutely didn't, actually. It was one of the major reasons why our economy is in the doldrums. I find it extraordinary that people that sat by QE, supported it, sat by 0% interest rates, supported it, but QE in particular, are now pontificating on this kind of stuff, people like Andrew Bailey.
And what do you mean when you say intervened in price? Because it pumped up the price of assets?
That's one part of it. Another is that basically allowed zombie firms to carry on for longer than they should have because they were able to access much cheaper credit. Those companies should have gone bust. There should have been then, reallocation of resources into more productive parts of the economy. It's a major reason why we've had zero growth basically for 2 decades. It's a major reason. So clearly you are massively distorting prices, and the idea of a market allocating resources efficiently when you have 0% interest rates for the best part of 12 years, I think it was. So the BOE has been part of this. Also, the Bank of England sets interest rates. Now, that's not a price cap, but it is a form of quasi-price cap in terms of the costs of borrowing, right? So it is an intervention into the market. We don't think of it like that, but it is. Some ultra-libertarian economists say you shouldn't have a Federal Reserve or a central bank doing that because it distorts actually efficient allocation of resources. So this idea that we have the free market, don't intervene, the Bank of England intervenes all the time. We take it for normal because it happens, right? As we do with most things. Secondly, price controls for expensive things in an emergency are obviously not a problem, in my view. The question is, what's the threshold?
Well, essential things which have become expensive.
Are we there right now? Yeah. So, for instance, during COVID, you saw massive price gouging on things like hand sanitizer, right? It was still affordable, but it probably isn't sensible in a pandemic for hand sanitizer to be, £10 for a unit, for instance, right? In that context, you should have, I think, price controls on things like hand sanitizer, gloves, masks, etc. So, in certain contexts, it's obviously a sensible thing to do. Are we there yet is another question. I'll return to that in a minute. Thirdly, on Stuart Rose, at the start of that, he was incensed. The former CEO of Marks and Spencer, he's saying, I've been in this game for decades. He was also leading the debate to remain in the European Union in 2016. He was Mr. Remain. Maybe Stuart Rose doesn't know this, but there are price caps in the European Union. Your roaming charges when you go overseas to use your phone, they've been capped. It's a very competitive, regulated market as well. But before they were capped, you had certain service providers completely taking the mickey with data charges. And they've been capped. And now it doesn't happen anymore. And the consumer is the massive beneficiary. Nothing awful has happened. So price caps sometimes can be a really, really good idea. Does Stuart Rose know that? His beloved EU introduced those price caps. I suspect not. Sticking with the EU, we also have massive subsidies to farmers in the European Union with the Common Agricultural Policy. So the idea that you have a free market and this really efficient allocation of resources because of supply and demand, the European Union, which you wanted this country to stay in, massively distorts prices by giving subsidies to farmers. The rationale being we need food security. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. You can agree or disagree, but it runs in contrast to this very ideological thinking that you see. We can never have price controls. That's from the Soviet Union. No, we have them. We have them with roaming. We have a big intervention on prices with agricultural goods. And like I say, we have central banks determining the rate of borrowing, capital, right? Capital allocation. So it's a really ideological claim to say that the government should never intervene. It's happening all the time. Do you want to do it? Is it sensible in this particular context? From what I see, the big problems with regards to inflation and costs for the average person in Britain are energy and housing. And also if you're a business, rent, okay? I think we need to be looking at those and getting them down. I think you probably do need some kinds of caps in certain kinds of contexts. I think we should, for instance, have rent caps of some kind. You can make them quite generous and there'd still be much more stability for your average renter. I think we want rent caps as well for small businesses. If somebody has a 5-year tenure and then they renew for 5 years, it can't go up by more than 15% or something. That's quite sensible. If you don't like that rule, sell the commercial property. Maybe they might be able to buy it. With regards to food, I don't know. Because you look at the average Brit and how much food is costing them compared to 10, 20, 30 years ago, those are not the goods that have become comparatively more expensive. A loaf of bread is a lot more expensive now than it was a couple of years ago, but still you can go to most supermarkets, get a loaf of bread for about £1, right? Whereas if you look at housing costs, if you look at energy costs, it's a different story. So I would like a left-wing government, and this government is not a left-wing government, but if you had a left or centre-left government that was talking about price controls and price caps, I would want them to be laser focused on energy and rents and housing.
I think the argument, sort of someone like Isabella Weber talks about, who we've had on the show before, she wrote about how China avoided the shock therapy. That was sort of her big famous breakout book, but now writes a lot about price controls. Her argument is that we need some forms of price controls, basically as an anti-fascist economics, because she sort of says one thing that makes the public angrier than anything else is going to a shop and the price of essentials going through the roof. And so she sort of talks about this as a political necessity, which I think has sort of something to it. I suppose the bit I'm slightly less convinced on is, I mean, this is not, the government are saying, look, you do us a favor by reducing the price of this, making a loss, and we will help you here. What I think the argument often put to the supermarkets is the reason the eggs and the bread are expensive is because they're price gouging. I mean, if their profit margins are 2 to 4%, that just doesn't look like price gouging to me. Because if you get rid of the profits, it's only going to reduce the prices by 4%, which isn't really going to keep anyone happy.
You know, if you look at Amazon, and, you know, I've had these conversations with people like Cory Doctorow, Amazon have a deal with their vendors, which is if you sell on Amazon, you can't have a lower price anywhere else in the economy, right? So if I have, you know, if I'm selling Bic pens and I'm Bic and I have a deal with Amazon and they sell for £4 for 10 on Amazon, I can't then do a deal with Tesco or Asda or Sainsbury and sell them cheaper. They have to be the same price as they are on Amazon. So again, we do have price fixing all over the economy, although this is quote unquote voluntary market price fixing. That, I think, is a really big cause of inflation in the economy because, you know, actually Sainsbury's might be able to do it for 10p cheaper or Tesco 20p cheaper. And there's a whole tranche of competition we're not getting because of Amazon's market-making role for these kinds of goods and services. And Cory goes into really big detail in his book about that. Now, I'm not saying that's huge amounts of inflation. It might just be 0.25%. It might be just a tiny bit, but it's still inflation. And for small and medium-sized businesses who do sell on Amazon, it's a problem for them because they say, well, I sell this much volume on Amazon, but if that's the price at which I sell to everybody, the big supermarkets don't want to stock it, right? I can't. So I'm actually now dependent on this US sort of big tech giant instead of having a wider college of national firms that want to sell my goods. So again, this may be an issue. You know, I'm not Isabella Weber. I'm not that smart. I'm not James Meadway. I'm not that smart. But if I look at the list of where inflation's coming from, who the bad guys are, how we can rectify it, it just doesn't seem that high up on my agenda. And I'll add one more thing as well. We need to euthanize the rentier. So we need to deal with rents. Like I say, that's for individuals with homes, but it's also for businesses as well. You know, you should be able to say to people like Tesco, Sainsbury's, if you've got a problem with high rents in inner city shops, James was saying that one store of Tesco will charge more than another one 2 miles down the road because it's the Tesco Metro. Have that conversation. Say, okay, well, how can we get the price in a Tesco Metro the same as, quote unquote, the big Tesco that's out of town? Why can we do that? You'll be told it's things like rents. Okay, then let's try and work out how we can address that situation. That to me seems sensible, but I'm not opposed to price caps. I like price caps, right? I like them. I'm just saying with regards to things like milk, eggs, bread, I don't see that as, that is not on a par with rent right now. That is not on a par with energy. And if you're trying to make this debate with the wider public, I think that's where you'd start.
It is also with supermarkets. I mean, supermarkets are the classic one where like the communist leader comes over to the West and says, okay, you've got it right. Right. That's like literally like Gorbachev or Deng. They come and they look at the supermarket and they say, okay, maybe actually competition does stock the shelves better and give people what they want. So I mean, I think, yeah, maybe some price controls in these exceptional situations on like essential goods, recognizing that, you know, that cost will end up being shifted elsewhere. But to me, the supermarket sector isn't really the problem with modern capitalism.
Or it is, but you go the other way, right? Which is things like meat and eggs and milk are too cheap. And actually it means, and I don't think that consumers should pay more for them, but it does mean that dairy farmers, for instance, they're operating at tiny margins and they leave that industry. Or meat, very cheap meat means that the animals live in extraordinary, horrible situations. Or cheap eggs because of battery farming, battery hens, which I think, you know, that's less of a thing now than it was in the decades past, but that's where cheap eggs really came from. You know, cheap chicken meat, one of the leading sources of pollution with regards to our rivers in this country are from chicken farming, industrial chicken farming. So you can't say, I want cheap meat, cheap eggs, but we also want to save the planet. There's a problem there too. So, you know, I don't want to come across as some sort of lib, but just because a policy is radical doesn't mean, or it sounds radical, doesn't mean I'm going to support it, because there are other parts to this here where I just think you're spending that political capital. Is that as good as rent caps, energy price caps, public ownership of energy? You know, is that ecologically aligned with my priorities? I don't think so. I don't know. And that's the conversation, you know, I'd like to have with someone like James or Isabella.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, with rent caps, I think there's an argument for them, but you need way more supply. You need to make sure that supply becomes cheaper, which is probably the same when it comes to food. The sort of the price cap, there's only so much that's going to do. You need to sort of unlock the bottlenecks. Labour Together is the group that catapulted Keir Starmer to Downing Street, yet after controversies, including spying on and smearing journalists, it's so discredited, it's changed its name. Labour Together is now called Think Labour. Its former director, Josh Simons, also famously, as you'll know, resigned from government as a result of the scandal, and he's now resigned from Parliament. A new name, though, for the organisation and a lowly resignation will not clear the stink created by the Labour Together controversy. And a new article from the investigative blog Democracy for Sale has today uncovered new evidence showing that the highest parts of the Labour Party were implicated in the nefarious behaviour of the organisation. To quickly remind you of how we got here, Labour Together was set up by Morgan McSweeney to regain control of the Labour Party for the party's right, and they then failed to declare hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of donations. And after this was reported by the Sunday Times and by independent journalist Paul Holden, Labour Together hired private investigators to dig up dirt on the journalists in question. And this we already knew. It led to the resignation of Josh Simons, who sort of commissioned those private investigators to dig up dirt on those journalists. The Labour Party itself, though, has tried to distance itself from the scandal, sort of suggests this is something about this organisation, nothing to do with this party that we occupy. However, in documents obtained via a subject access request, Josh Simons can be seen to have emailed Paul Ovenden and Morgan McSweeney, then both working at Labour HQ, briefing them about the private investigators' findings. We'll read you this email here. So from Josh Simons to Paul Ovenden to Morgan McSweeney. Hi, Tom Harper on copy will be delivering his report on Paul Holden on Monday. Could we find a time for Tom, Morgan, Paul and me to Zoom or meet in HQ sometime after that next week? Thanks so much, Josh. Well, I'm joined now by the subject of that email, Paul Holden. Paul, welcome back to the show. I suppose if you could briefly, before we get into sort of today's development, remind us again of the nature of the investigation that was commissioned into yourself and journalists at the Sunday Times by Labour Together.
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on again and to talk about the story, which never seems to go away. What happened very briefly is that in mid-2023, I went to the Sunday Times to Keppel Parkland with a set of documents about these unreported donations, which seemed to point to the fact that there was a chance that Morgan McSweeney had deliberately chosen not to report them. And then when they were investigated by the Electoral Commission, they weren't candid in their responses. And of course, we now know that Keir Starmer benefited, at least indirectly, from these undeclared funds because they paid for polling and all sorts of work that then fed into his leadership election campaign. So it's quite a big story to begin with if you look at it. So basically, there is an undeclared pot of money that is responsible for making Keir Starmer leader of the Labour Party. And at that point, when the story is about to come out, the Prime Minister of the country, according to all polling. And pretty much within days of the story coming out in the Sunday Times and me doing some reporting with Matt Taibbi in the States, Labour Together appoints this firm called APCO Worldwide, which is a sort of a reputation management firm, PR firm, which helps big corporations dust bust difficult stories, basically. And what happens at that point is that APCO are, we've now seen the contract. I've now got a subject access request out of Labour Together, or now they're called Think Labour, which gives much more sort of granular detail about how this all unfolded. And we could see very clearly, very early on, that the first contract that's signed between Labour Together and APCO Worldwide, within a week of the articles coming out, says very explicitly, we will deliver a package of materials that will be used to proactively undermine my reporting and the reporting that I was doing with Matt Taibbi in the States. Of course, there's no mention in those documents of investigating a hack or anything like that. It's pretty plain. This is being seen as a PR issue, as like, this is damaging to our political project. This is a damaging story. We need to deal with it. And that's precisely what APCO sets out to do.
And at the time this email was sent, so from Josh Simons to Paul Ovenden and Morgan McSweeney, so back in 2024, I think they were both in HQ, weren't they? They then went on to become, so Morgan McSweeney became Chief of Staff to Starmer in Downing Street, and Paul Ovenden became, I think, chief of comms. Had there previously been a denial that they knew anything about this investigation into you? Does this sort of go against what they've previously publicly said, or does this just sort of confirm something you already suspected?
To be honest, I had no idea that Paul Ovenden had any connection to this whatsoever. I mean, it's quite ironic because one of the first big stories that I released from the book was about Paul Ovenden and actually led to his resignation, because at the time he was director of strategy in Number 10. This was just right before Labour Party conference, and I'd had these internal Labour Party messages about him saying some pretty unpleasant things about Diane Abbott, which I gave to ITV. So it's kind of a bit of a shock to me that actually one of the people that I was effectively exposing with my book was involved in this. I had no idea whatsoever. I mean, Morgan McSweeney never gives a comment on the record. So we have so there's been no official denial from Morgan McSweeney. He's never quoted on the record about anything. The extent to which we've gotten some comment has been, if friends of Morgan McSweeney say he had no idea this was being commissioned or something like that. So we've never really had no denial. Now we have, this is absolutely rock solid proof. It's the first time I've known absolutely for certain. I've always suspected, I can never prove, I've always suspected it, but now we know absolutely for certain that Morgan McSweeney and Paul Ovenden were copied into this. I should also point out there's a third name on that email that's been redacted. So there's a third person who received this email. I have no idea who they are. They're a person who was employed by the Labour Party, but that's been redacted. So I have no clue who this third person could be. But I think what, if I'm allowed to editorialize a bit, I think what it quite clearly shows, if you look at the context of the email and its wording, Josh Simonton, he writes to Morgan McSweeney and to Paul Ovenden, he's not saying, "Hi, here's Tom Harper you've never met. This is the organization APCO. We've been doing an investigation into Paul Holden and other people." It's very plain from the email that they're discussing something they all know about already. And there is a plan to then meet to discuss the work they all know about. So at the very highest levels of the Labour Party, this is really a joint project. This is a joint project about how to respond to a damaging story. And we now know Democracy for Sale is confirmed with the Labour Party. So also this meeting that they plan here does actually happen. And then within days, I'm being reported to security services on the basis of really wild allegations. I mean, I should say that the report that APCO then delivers, I've now seen the content of the report pretty much for the first time ever through the subject access request. I'm not going to repeat the allegations in there. It's beyond what's been reported in the public domain. And they are absolutely probably the most defamatory allegations you could imagine being put about a journalist. That could have had such deep and profound, far-reaching impacts on active investigations and collaborations I was doing with law enforcement around the world. But, if anybody had gotten a document, the media organization had gotten a document and reported that straight, it would have ruined my life and my reputation. Absolutely. It would have ruined the life and reputation of my colleagues and the small little nonprofit we run called Shadow Work Investigations, which does anti-corruption work. It would have absolutely, all the philanthropic funding we would have gotten would have dried up in a heartbeat. So it's not just that they were spying on us. It's not just that there was a campaign to look into us and find what was actually produced in the end. And there's more to be told again about how that's produced. But the thing that's actually produced in the end is this really genuinely despicable document that if it was ever published in any way would be ruinous to my life, my career, to all of my colleagues, my associates, all the people that we employ. A lot of people who just happen to know me, who happen to work at the same building as me, fell under the scope of this investigation. And it really is the absolute pits the darkest of dark art stuff.
Artificial intelligence looks set to become the most important technology of this century, which means the titans of the industry will likely continue to accrue enormous wealth and enormous power. And the most famous of the AI executives are Sam Altman and Elon Musk, the CEOs of OpenAI and xAI. And both appear to love making bold claims about the future of humanity, and their public battles with each other keep them in the headlines. However, when it comes to the key leaders in the AI world, there is a more unassuming CEO who is just as likely to control the machines and algorithms that get us to AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Demis Hassabis is a former child prodigy, a Nobel laureate, and the co-founder and CEO of Google DeepMind, whose AI model Gemini is one of the frontier large language models. Hassabis is also a subject of a new best-selling biography by two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist Sebastian Mallaby. The book is called The Infinity Machine, Demis, Hassabis, DeepMind, and the Quest for Super Intelligence. Obviously, this very much falls in the wheelhouse of topics I find fascinating and like to talk about. And I have a long interview coming out with Sebastian in the coming days. And for now, here's a preview where we talk about Demis Hassabis' approach to AI risk.
Demis's view is he has ideas about safety. If they were to come to fruition, people would think it was the idea of some government leader because he would have given it to them. And he doesn't want to take credit because he thinks that by taking credit, you're less likely to have a result. So, the Bletchley AI Summit in 2023 was his idea, suggested to Rishi Sunak. He never told me that. I only know that because I know Rishi's advisors. Demis fought this secret fight called Project Mario for 3 years against Sundar Pichai and the Google leadership about putting more safety oversight on his technology. And he lost that fight. But the fact that he fought it for 3 years and burnt up a lot of his energy doing it suggests that he did care quite a lot about safety. So I'm confident when I say this is a good person who cares about safety, who wants good outcomes for humanity. He did AI for biology and AlphaFold because he wants to do something other than just a chatbot. We should be happy that this person is running Google DeepMind, even if it's a dangerous technology that he hasn't been able to stop.
See, this is where I think you might have gone slightly too easy on him.
All right.
And the reason I say that is because, for one, some context, I had Nate Suarez, who I'm sure you've heard of, wrote the book with Eliezer Yudkowsky, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, who sort of got this doom hypothesis, which is if anyone builds AGI, well, it's in the title, isn't it? We all die. As I said to Nate, I don't feel like I'm actually really smart enough to adjudicate between the claims and whether or not I actually believe that. But with people like Geoffrey Hinton out there saying he thinks there's a significant chance that if this technology develops, we'll all die, I take it very, very seriously. I think a problem is that we're waiting for a tipping point. We're waiting for something to happen where politicians say, okay, this must be serious. And I think someone very high up in the industry making a clear and obvious personal sacrifice could be that, right? If you've got, we were having this conversation with Nate with reference to Dario Amodei, because I was saying, if he gives up this company worth billions, clearly he'll have taken a big hit, right? So if he says, we need to slow down and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is by standing down from this company, to me, that could be huge. That could be the tipping point we need. And by continuing to engage in the race, if you take the existential threat seriously, I think it's not quite good enough to say that, well, it's better him than someone else. If it weren't him, it weren't Sam Altman. Because of the people who have agency, if we see ourselves hurtling towards catastrophe, Demis Hassabis is probably one of the top 10 people in terms of the agency to stop that happening. And I think looking at his behavior, whether or not he's a nice guy, I have no doubt he is. I definitely have no doubt he's an incredibly intelligent man. It doesn't really seem to me that he's doing everything in his power to stop this, because I think that would involve publicly risking your career, which he, hasn't done.
Look, I get it. I think the counter to that would be that Jeff Hinton quit Google. Jeff Hinton, a lot of public pull as well, right? Nobel Prize winner after all. He quits Google and he says, AI is super dangerous, and I think there's a 50% chance that it will wipe us out. And, there's a bunch of media interviews, and that's great. And he's writing a book now, and he's a great guy. And I went to speak to him for my book. I love Jeff Hinton, but he didn't really do anything at all to change the path of what's happening.
He has done more than anyone else, I think, to popularize the idea that this is really dangerous, right?
Well, the end result is the technology has accelerated since he made those statements. It hasn't slowed down.
But that's not his fault.
All right. But
if Geoffrey Hinton hadn't come out and said those things, also it was less dramatic because he wasn't actually, he had a decent paid job, but he wasn't sort of a CEO of one of these companies. If one of the CEOs of one of the major 4 companies resigns, that is a news story in the way that Geoffrey Hinton, well beyond retirement age, quits his post at Google.
I guess the question is whether, is there a danger of doing the politics of gesture? Right, you do a resignation. It's a story for a month. The world moves on. I just doubt that even Dario Amodei or Demis Hassabis resigning from their jobs would change the path of a technology where China is also racing at the same time, and where the amount of money behind this is in the hundreds of billions. I just don't think an individual can do that. I think we have a collective action problem in the world where we need to get multiple labs in multiple countries to slow down all at once. And to solve collective action problems, you need government. And I think the best thing that Demis and people like this can do, and I think actually Demis is doing this behind the scenes, is to speak to politicians and say, look, you need to take this seriously. This is dangerous. You need to kind of have a serious AI safety institute that can veto the release of models that should be tested before release, just like a medicine is tested by the FDA in America. And if it's going to be harmful to society, you don't let it to be. It's not allowed to be released. And I think making those arguments and trying to pull the government in. The best thing Dario Amodei has done is not fighting with the Pentagon over red lines on military use of weapons, because he was right about that, but ineffectual. The most important thing he's done is to explain to the government that Mythos, which can do cyber hacking, is enough to crash the whole global financial system and more. And that got their attention. And they did a 180 in Washington, D.C., right? They went from saying, let's just accelerate this technology. We don't care. There's no danger, nothing to see here on the danger side. And now they're saying, wait, and they've taken control of Mythos, and they're prohibiting it from being distributed beyond the initial 40 institutions that got it. So that had a big effect. So in this case, what happened is it was the advance of the technology more than a public argument about safety that actually drove safety behavior. So just to step back, because I think we're having a good debate here, and I definitely respect both sides of this. I think the question is, if Demis could really stop the AI race by quitting tomorrow, he should quit tomorrow. I just don't believe that would be the outcome.
You've said there that Dario Amodei, sort of the fight he had with the Pentagon, turned out not to be that significant. And so for context, we did cover it on the show, but he said he wanted some guardrails, which meant that the Pentagon couldn't use Claude for fully autonomous weapons. So weapons
fully autonomous lethal weapons. That's right.
Fully autonomous lethal weapons, so without a human in the loop, and surveillance on Americans. The Pentagon was saying, we want the rights to use this for quote unquote all legal purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Dario Amodei said that's not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to work with you.
Mm-hmm.
Now that would have been powerful were it not the case that all the other AI companies came in and said, okay, we'll work with you, Pentagon, on your terms.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those AI companies was Google DeepMind.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't want to have a debate with you as if you are Demis Hassabis. But to me, that doesn't necessarily speak to an organization which is playing sort of the responsible role in this race, which sort of Hassabis and the people around him admit is very dangerous, because he's actively, or Google is actively undermining any possible cooperation between the companies to try and limit the extent to which their technology can be used towards lethal ends.
I think the first underminer was OpenAI. They came in quickest and offered to help the Pentagon if the Pentagon was going to cease to use Claude. I mean, they were there within sort of an hour or something. I mean, it was crazy, crazy fast. But you're right, the Google DeepMind also went in. And this speaks to two things. One conclusion that you could draw from this is there's a collective action problem. And Google DeepMind has made a decision that since it can't, as one actor, solve that collective action problem, it's going to give in to the pressure of collective action problems until the government steps in and does something. I think, look, but I understand the point. I mean, he's not standing back from the race. He's definitely leaning into the race. And his argument for why that's the best he can do is because the race itself is the problem. It's not the actions of one individual racer. I think there's a similar thing, by the way, to make an argument on your side here, which is relates to open source, open weight models, right? So Google DeepMind was happy to announce maybe a month ago a new suite of Gemma models, which are open weight. By Demis's own account, open weight is dangerous. And yet he's providing open weight models. because he thinks that the Chinese are providing open weight models. The state of the art is in open weight is actually China. And it's not going to help the world if all of the open weight customers are using Chinese, systems.
I just think, going back to we won't spend too long here, but going back to the Pentagon example, a collective action problem, I suppose, is particularly intractable if there are lots and lots of different actors, and it's quite difficult for them to communicate with each other. It's hard to sort of isolate any one person who sort of breaks the deal because there's too many people. When it comes to sort of the leading AI labs, by many accounts, there's three, right? There's DeepMind, there's OpenAI, and there's Anthropic, the real frontier labs. Now, when it came to the Pentagon, one of those said, "We won't do this for you, Pentagon." Then ChatGPT, which is obviously Claude, Anthropic, then ChatGPT comes out and says, "Okay, we will." Now you've got a third player, Google DeepMind, and they can choose to sort of make a big public campaign and say, "We are siding with Anthropic. We think Sam Altman is an immoral guy. We think it is urgent that we have some kind of public legislation to hold back irresponsible people like Sam Altman." It's not as if Google DeepMind is just one among many companies. If they hadn't done it, someone else would. They're clearly one of the most powerful agents in this. And I think if they had said that, that would have big impact. But they've done the precise opposite. They've come in and said, "Oh, we'll do it as well," which means that it's very difficult to critique Sam Altman, because if someone tries to say, "Sam Altman, you've behaved very irresponsibly here," he'll just say, "Well, Google DeepMind did it as well."
I think that's fair.
That was Sebastian Mallaby. We'll put out the whole interview in the coming days. We chatted for about an hour, covered a lot of ground. Rachel Reeves today was at a petrol station announcing a freeze to fuel duty. Let's take a look at what happened.
Nigel Farage! You are Nigel! We're going to get arrested! We've got English flags on here, Rachel! We're going to get arrested! You're ruining the country! Get Keir Starmer out! Look, England flags! You're useless! Labour Party's useless!
I love our country, and one of the things about our country is good manners. Not very British. So the news about the freezing.
That's gone viral on Twitter. Nigel Farage has said that he will buy that guy who shouted at Rachel Reeves a pint. Who do you think came off better in that interaction?
Just shouting at politicians, I'm not a big fan of anyway. I think criticising them is perfectly legitimate. Asking them political questions, saying, "What is your position on X?" Even if you're shouting, I get that, but just literally hectoring them, I don't really see the point of it. I thought she came across better. I think it's really bad that Nigel Farage, and I'm not one of these people that moralises about this stuff, but I just think it's really unserious of Nigel Farage to say, "Well, I'll buy this guy a pint." He's hectoring a politician. It happens to you. The thing is, Michael, if he was hectored by somebody, Nigel Farage has a really tough time in public life, right? Which he constantly reminds people about. If he was hectored like that, and then Rachel Reeves responded in a similar manner, we would hear no end of effectively cry-bullying. "Oh my God, I'm the victim." And in a way, good for Rachel Reeves. She stood up for herself. I quite like that. I don't really like Rachel Reeves. Politically, I don't like her. I don't think she's a very effective politician. But the fact she had a bit of backbone and responded rather than say, "Oh my God, this is abuse, I have to run away," tweet about how she's abused, and I think that's really positive. But this is happening across the country now as politicians. Councillors, council leaders, MPs, and even people like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, from bottom to top, and it's not good. It's not good because it's not productive political conversation. If you're saying, "Rachel Reeves, you've increased national insurance contributions for my employees, I've had to lay people off. Think again," or "You're killing my business," that's legit. But just going, use are useless, get Nigel in. And I do think it's part of the death of a deferential culture. Has good aspects too, of course. But 25 years ago, when I was a kid, in the late 90s, the idea of people shouting at the Chancellor of the Exchequer, even if they were really unpopular, like Norman Lamont after, the RM crisis, or Ken Clarke, was just unthinkable.
I did throw an egg at John Prescott, didn't they? That was probably around 2000.
Yeah, but it was an egg while he was campaigning a general election. Also, Ed Miliband had an egg thrown at him famously. But this is every day now. This is now what it's like to be a politician, right? Like I say, the same for councillors too. The local leader of my local council is a Liberal Democrat. Political opponents were putting up posters of him saying he's a paedophile. He's not a paedophile.
And it is going to make talented people not want to go into it.
100%. And I say this as somebody who's not a fan of Rachel Reeves, but that was just a snapshot of something which is happening, which is much bigger.
She had a decent policy as well. We were talking yesterday about why HS2 costs so much money. We're saying, I mean, it's not the main reason, actually. I think the main reason is that no one, they don't have a permanent engineering department to do it. They're not used to doing grand projects like they are in France. But we did mention judicial review as well. Rachel Reeves has now today said that any sort of critical green infrastructure cannot be subject to judicial review unless it's for a fundamental human right. Everything else, just build the goddamn thing. So it seems to me like a sensible policy. And
she's freezing fuel duty there, and she's still getting it in the neck. But the thing is, Michael, this is not political. It's something Dan Hodges said about the by-election in Gorton and Denton. It wasn't when people were on the doors, politicians were on the doors talking to voters. They weren't having policy debates where they could be persuaded. They'd basically made up their minds about who they liked and who they didn't like. It was about activating that for a vote on the Green side, on the Labour side, on the Reform side. And his view with Burnham is it's the same. You are not going to turn Burnham voters away from Burnham because of this or that policy. They like him. They've got a habit of voting for him. They'll probably vote for him again. I think that's probably right in Makerfield. But it's not good. We need a thoughtful, sensible political debate in this country. And cheering that on, I don't think it's violent. I think it's legit. You shout, you're not hurting anybody. I get it. I just wonder, is that going to help the country move in the right direction? I want this country to succeed. If you want this country to succeed, I don't know why you think that's a sensible way to carry on.
Yeah, he shouldn't be arrested. He also shouldn't be praised, probably.
No, but also this victim, though. I mean, this dude saying, oh, you're going to arrest me because I've got a flag. Everybody's a victim now, and it's like, again, people like Farage or Zair Yusuf would love to attack the left and say, you had a culture of victimhood. I think that's just everywhere now. That's all of us.
Let's wrap up. Aaron, thank you for joining me tonight.
Michael, my pleasure. Thanks again to all those new supporters out there. We're almost at 3,000.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
You've done us good. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.